Hello, you're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking in philosophy, the social sciences, and effective altruism. In this episode, we talked to Anna Alexandrova, a reader in philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. As her website puts it, Anna studies how scientists navigate morally charged and complex phenomena, and the role of formal tools such as models and indicators in their scholarly and public work. In particular, much of Anna's work looks at the measurement of well-being. For instance, is there or should there be a single measure of overall well-being? Can the science of well-being be objective, or does any plausible measure rely on values? And what do philosophers mean by well-being in the first place? That is all roughly the topic of our first bit of conversation, which then kind of turns into a discussion of technocratic versus more democratic ways of constructing measures of well-being. After that, we talk a bit about the use and abuse of formal models in economics. So, a lot of how academic economics gets done involves taking a real-world thing, which you want to explain, and then thinking up a fairly abstract, mathsy way to model what's going on, typically using the so-called rational choice framework. Then the economist looks at what the model implies in terms of testable predictions and tests those predictions with real-world data. And if the model fits well enough, then it's said to explain the real-world thing. Now, Anna has argued that formal models have become overrated as tools for explanation in economics. In fact, she says sometimes they just don't explain at all. Instead, Anna says, the economics discipline would do well to pay more attention to historical explanations and qualitative evidence. So we ask Anna about all that and how economics might begin to open up to these other methods. And then, on a similar vein, we finish up by talking about Anna's own subject, philosophy of science, and what its relationship should be with the sciences. So should it just be asking big, profound questions about, the scientific method? Or should it be wading into conversations about institutions and norms and actual scientific practice? By which I mean conversations with actual scientists. And I think Anna has a really interesting perspective on that. Okay, without further ado, here's the episode.
Thank you. So I'm Anna Alexandrova. I'm now a reader in philosophy of science at Cambridge University, and I have arrived to this point via a very roundabout route, growing up in Soviet Union just as it was collapsing, and then studying in a whole lot of different places before ending up for a PhD in University of California, San Diego. And the reason why I do philosophy of social science, when I look back at it, it's got to have something to do with growing up in the collapsing empire. Because the fundamental experience of a teenager in the 90s is this enormous uncertainty, social uncertainty about where we're going, what we're doing, and who knows what to do. And the experience of watching a lot of talking heads on TV and experts talking about, we need to open the economy, or no, we need to go back to the glory of Soviet Union, or no, we need to do this, or we need to do that, and girls should be like that, and boys should be like that, and sort of being bombarded by this enormous variety of lives you could live and ways in which you could organize a society. So by the time I just saw the name of a discipline, the first time I saw it, I think, was when I researched master's degrees at LSE, philosophy of social science. I had no idea what that's about, but the combination just blew me away. I can do that. It felt right. And by the time I arrived to London School of Economics in 98 to do a master's in this discipline, I realized that it was about that big meta question about who gets to say that they know about how to live and how to organize a society, and is there a right or wrong there? Is there a prospect for a scientific approach to it? that hit the spot. And, looking back now, that's almost 25 years ago, it doesn't seem like I really got interested in anything other than that fundamental question. And everything I did after that, every single project I have pursued has been a project about what is knowledge of society and who gets to do it.
What a fantastic answer. I think in general, it's easy to kind of over-connect, autobiography to your interest nowadays. But in this instance, it does seem right. And hearing that, it does make me think that I've grown up, and I guess, Luca, you've grown up in a period, I guess, of kind of relative stability where it's easy to be lulled into the sense that, there are adults in the room and they've got things more or less figured out. And so what's left to do is just kind of policy tweaks at the margin, right? The range of reasonable options is very narrow.
Adults in the room is a really interesting thought. Just philosophically, think about it, Finn. And what do you want to have the adults in the room for? At this point, I'm very much an adult in the room for my students and my children. And it's an enormous responsibility and sort of the weight I feel of it every day. And I can be an adult in the room for their emotional support and for their help. But I think it's hard to be an adult in the room for really big fundamental choices about how to live and where a community or a society should go. So I think I'd like to retain forever a child in the room approach towards the really big social and moral questions.
Yeah, and I think it's also the title, right, of Varoufakis's kind of biography when he was negotiating with the European Union, right, kind of adults in the room. And he pointed out, I think, throughout kind of that there's also something that comes with it of not being able to kind of question authority and stuff, right? And just because people are senior and have had lots of experiences, it's also easy to kind of fall into existing structures and not be able to question the status quo and just kind of accepting it. And that kind of childlike curiosity or willingness to ask challenging questions as well is really important.
Agreed. Let's all forever remain open-minded about what counts as an adult in the room and what we expect from them.
Especially, just to go down this rabbit hole even further, when you're talking about social sciences and you hear the word science, especially when they have this kind of economicsy flavor, when there's lots of numbers flying around, it's easy to get the impression that people have managed to transform questions about, how we ought to live or how we ought to arrange communities into scientific questions on a par with other sciences. And then it's oh, that's quite a comforting impression. But of course it's not true, right? There's kind of, you can't ever close the gap like that. Okay, let's talk about well-being. So this has been a focus of your research and writing. And we'll talk about what you have to say especially, but let's just begin with terminology. Well-being means a lot of things. I know a lot of people think of wellness, and they think of yoga and spa music. But in the context of philosophy, what does well-being kind of taken to mean, just in the most general terms, so we're on the same page?
I really like your starting point, Finn. Let's recognize that the term well-being gets used by very many different people in many different circumstances, and they will hear different things when pronouncing it. And I think that is a big deal and should be a starting point of any discussion, that it is one of those vague concepts that has had a place in many different spheres of life. When Tolstoy talks about how to live, he talks about well-being without using a term. When economists talk about what to maximize, they talk about welfare using sometimes the term well-being too. When life coaches talk about helping people find themselves, they're talking about something akin to that. And coming to philosophy, I think it is really important to recognize kind of the parochialism of the question, that we are, when a philosopher is asked to define well-being, they will be talking within this specific context, which is doing ethics and meta-ethics in the analytic tradition in 20th and 21st century. And this is the point at which the concept of well-being gets identified with a kind of value that is not moral value, not aesthetic value, not political value. It gets identified with a prudential value, the value that is good for someone. It is a nice circumscribing move that philosophers make, which is often completely unrecognizable to others. And it was unrecognizable in early modern periods and the classical period philosophy, where you talk about what's good and what's good, right? And you don't talk about different kinds of good. Moral good is distinct from prudential good. But when we arrive to philosophy at this point in history, yes, the term well-being has been defined as a kind of value that is distinct from moral value, and a value that attaches to a person specifically. So then we begin to build a theory of that value, and this theory is usually, we've already taken this very individualist focus, right? What is good for a person, and we try to do it at the most abstract level, and this person has to be just a person, not someone embedded in the context, in the culture, in the history. We try to come up with a theory at the most abstract level that would work for everyone. So the key to recognize, I think, here is that the philosophical theorizing about well-being is a very peculiar exercise. And the big question for me has always been, how do you connect that peculiar exercise to the practice?
Yeah, interesting, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. But just to say that back, to make sure I'm getting it. So when we talk about someone's well-being, we're talking about something like how well their life is going, all things considered. But crucially, we mean how well their life is going for them, right? So that's what kind of prudential is meaning here. And then you made this point that this is like such an abstract idea we're starting off with, right? You almost couldn't get more all-encompassing than the kind of philosopher's notion of well-being. It's not even relative to any kind of context, right? So when we talk about well-being, we're not yet talking about well-being for a certain kind of person, like a child or an adult or something. We just mean for any person, how well their life is going, right? So I guess the thing that's clear here is that this is a very early starting point. We can't do much with it when it comes to making decisions or forming policy or something. And I guess you can work your way up through more contextualized and concrete theories. And something else you're doing is, if you're interested in actually making, for instance, policy decisions based on your theory of well-being, you also want a way of measuring it or finding out how well off or worse off people are. And so maybe could you say something about, in practice, how does a well-being measure get made? So how do we go from the kind of abstract philosophizing to the, surveys that get handed out or whatever else it is?
Great question. So the first thing to recognize is for well-being to become an object of science, it needs to make a trip into another discipline. Right? So it is very familiar point from history of science that as an object travels from one field to another, it loses something, it gains something. So that big all-encompassing, all things considered good for a person concept of well-being, when it needs to be operationalized by scientists, it will become simpler, it will become more limited, and it will be represented by an indicator. So it is extremely unlikely to have direct measures of well-being. I suppose it depends, what theory of well-being you will adopt. But scientists will inevitably make a decision about what counts as well-being for their purposes. So what happened in the throughout 20th century is that different disciplines have appropriated the concept of well-being, and they have devised different sets of indicators surrounding them. So, economists adopt the concepts of well-being, say, what's the closest thing that we've got in our theory that's to do with well-being? Well, it's the preferences. And then so that satisfying the preferences, what's the best thing that we've got measuring that? Behavior. Well, what kind of behavior? Spending behavior. And that's how consumption and income become indicators of well-being. Then come, the rise of social indicators research and the sociologists and development scholars who want to represent this wider quality of life, who are often working on development projects. So that's kind of the mid-20th century post-colonial context. So they construct a bunch of multidimensional indicators. Well, child mortality, access to vaccinations, they've got their own. And then the interesting thing that happens in the end of 20th century, is sort of 80s and 90s, is well-being becomes an object of psychological sciences. And psychologists, they have their tools for measuring already a lot of psychological attributes, right? The psychometrics is already a science, and, we measure personality traits and attitudes and things like that. So that whole machinery then gets to define well-being anew, and it gets defined either as a mental state that gives an overall evaluation of life, so that becomes life satisfaction, or else mental states, that at a time gives a certain, the feel, right, the affective state. And so that becomes the more hedonic measures of well-being. And then, if we then take it further and, the eager policymaker from the 90s and early noughts walks in and says, we're going to fix the problems of politics by giving a neutral basis for policy. And that's going to be our evidence-based policy. We're going to need the measure of well-being, right? And which of these many options does this policymaker pick out of? Historically, there's been so many. And a big free-for-all happens, different scientists sort of trying to represent themselves as the experts of well-being. Well, I've got one, I've got one, I've got a measure, I've got a measure. And then what ends up happening is some kind of a complex and interesting outcome, such that, now Office of National Statistics in the UK collects a whole load of, a whole fantastically interesting, diverse dashboard of indicators. That's the short answer to your question.
Yeah, no, it sounds good. I'm curious as well. So you've mentioned all of these range of objective measures, which I'm sure we'll get into more in a little bit. But I'm curious as well, has there been much progress into just kind of embracing the subjectiveness and just really looking at people's self-reported kind of well-being or happiness as well? Is there much credence, like in the policy space, that gets given to those kinds of approaches?
Enormous amount of credence, and Finn probably has something to say about that. These psychologists that I've mentioned spent a lot of time and a lot of their efforts trying to show that we have got valid measures of those mental states, and those mental states are what matters. So they plug in a philosophical argument for them, and the subjective understanding of well-being. and they say, this is the stuff that on which we can collect data, and moreover, some of this data can be plugged in into very conventional econometrics, such that you'd be able to, there'd be a rating of life satisfaction, and that rating is something you can plug in into normal cost benefit or cost efficiency analysis. And then basically there isn't much of a change that's needed to your normal way of operating. And there's this alliance then between a psychologist and an economist to provide the new basis for policy. So in many ways, yes, Luca, there has been progress in the sense that psychologists have been able to say, well, what we've got is what we need.
Do you want to just tell the story of how we got here in the first place? Because it does seem right that there is a lot more interest in these subjective measures of well-being in policy now than even, 5 or 10 years ago. So can you put your finger on anything that changed?
Great, yes. I can tell you first, let's start with the origin story that well-being researchers themselves tell. But, origin stories are usually myths. So let's just keep that in mind. So here is the myth that comes out of the 90s and 80s and early noughts. Conventional economics relies on these cold, brutal numbers of GDP and consumption. The only reason why they've adopted these numbers is because they believe people maximize their utility, and because they adopt the preference satisfaction account of well-being. We now know, the psychologists who have discovered failures of rational choice theory, that is not true, and therefore we need a new basis for policy. So hence all these grand pronouncements that you hear, let us go beyond money, let us do a policy that really matters to people. It relies very much on the argument that traditional economics messed up in such and such ways, right? And while some economists have fought against that, others have embraced it and kind of rolled with it. The reason why it is a myth in many ways is because, consumption surveys and GDP studies have been misrepresented through all of this as being incredibly unsophisticated and caring only about money and things like that. And economists had very many different reasons not to measure happiness directly. And those reasons were not just prejudices. So you will hear nowadays a lot of economists saying, well, hold on, the whole point of respecting people's priorities is that we get them to weigh, how important experiences to them versus other things they're getting, right? So that's the great thing about the preference framework, is that it allows you to trade off some goods against others. And that's the whole point of an indifference curve, right? It's an amazing invention. So therefore, when we say, that there has been a great interest for subjective well-being and its role in policy, let's just not forget that, well, it's different people vying for influence ultimately, right? So, for some time, psychologists were in a good place vying for that influence. And I think there's a constant struggle going on there. So, there isn't much of a appetite for well-being policy. As soon as Brexit referendum happens, right, there was Cameron used to talk the talk and then it's completely disappeared off the agenda. So I think it's still kind of up for grabs where it's going to go. Let's just not forget that there isn't really here a single agenda. There are many different traditions that keep on bumping into each other. And whichever of them comes out, it's not because they necessarily have the truest and the best representation of well-being, but rather, for normal political reasons.
Yeah, okay, well, maybe I can say something, I don't know, in favour of that myth, because it may be a myth, but it's quite an optimistic one, right? So what's the story? Like you said, it's roughly that almost all policy, where it's relevant, is formed by economic indicators, which are kind of understood as proxies for well-being, but really what we're measuring is consumption, which is going to track well-being a bit, but isn't it just common sense that consumption isn't the same thing as well-being? A country and an individual can make an awful lot of money and consume an awful lot and be much worse off than some counterpart that is just happier or more contented, but not consuming quite so much. And then you have this kind of like really refreshingly hard-nosed camp, which is associated with people like Richard Layard, who just say, look, in order to do anything useful, we need to roll all these different indicators of well-being into a more or less a single number. And that number is going to stand for something like people's life satisfaction, right? How happy they say they are, or how happy with their life they say they are. And there's something to that, right? So it means you can compare the cost efficiency across different policies and different kind of big spending schemes. And also there's quite a nice advantage in that you can avoid being misled by kind of tempting narratives, right? Because you've got the numbers in front of you and one has made people happier and one hasn't. So I guess the question is something like, what could go wrong there? What's the skeptical response to that kind of inspiring story?
Thank you. You've given it a really good run. And I think what is even more inspiring there is, in that story, is an attempt to also give a democratic justification for this, that ultimately life satisfaction ratings will provide to us a summary of people's priorities. And then it's... once we've got a summary of that priorities, then we just have to go ahead and do the best we can, given the public money that we have, and spend them in the way that best meets people's priority. Who could possibly be against that? Who could possibly be against that? Well, just rewind back to your Ethics 101 objection to consequentialism from Bernard Williams. Consequentialism regards humans as receptacles for utility and not as agents of their life. And the well-being policy that is based on that does well-being at people, not with people, right? That is a phrase very much that I've been discussing with my colleague Diane Coyle, who I take it you've interviewed as well. We, in general, are interested in the fact that well-being policy, as proposed by Professor Layard and his colleagues, has this vision of the experts, scientists, providing valid measures and figuring out what causes well-being, and then the policymaker and who wants to maximize it, and then sort of this one person, what the expert passes on the knowledge to the policymaker figures out how to implement it. And there isn't really here any recognition of the politics of the situation. The politics of the situation is that your voice has been reduced to a number on the rating, right? There is a claim that life satisfaction measures are most democratic because they let people weigh the goods that are important for them. But well, there is more to being democratic and to being respectful, and that is, to ask people how do they understand their well-being. Right, life satisfaction is a summary of how you think you're doing. It is not a representation of what you think matters. So I, for instance, would be very worried if my local council was trying to maximize my life satisfaction instead of doing things that my community in a conversation as a whole decides counts, like bicycle lanes and early childhood intervention and support of the undeserved. So life satisfaction famously provides really embarrassing indicators for education. Like being around educating to people is bad for your life satisfaction, and being around there are all sorts of details like that I think need to be subject to democratic controls, not to technocratic controls. So one thing that we're working with now in the Bennett Institute for Public Policy with my colleagues like Diane Coyle and Mark Fabian is we're trying to figure out what would it mean for well-being policy to be not technocratic, but properly responsive to people's priorities. And I think we would need to get beyond that model of the expert and the policymaker figuring out what to do. I think we're going to need to inject proper, normal kind of politics into it. If you are going to have a measure of well-being that represents your community, you better talk through this measure with your community. And with your community, you better co-produce it or co-construct it. I can tell you about a project we are doing at the moment, trying to develop a measure of thriving for a Bristol-based poverty charity called Turn to Us, that try to help people in grave financial difficulty. So I don't think they should be using life satisfaction to decide where their money goes. I think they need to understand better the priorities and the concerns of their stakeholders. And I think that is overall a better model for well-being policy than the technocratic one.
Yeah, what a fantastic answer. Can I maybe try just kind of summarizing what you said, just to make sure I'm not missing it, because there was so much there. So maybe it's something like this, on this kind of technocratic model, right, where you have one big numerical measure of well-being, and that measure is life satisfaction, right? So concretely, you're, with actually not much extra detail, you're asking people how well they think their life is going, all things considered, out of 10. And then you're aggregating those numbers. And the picture is you have your kind of Whitehall technocrats. They get these surveys back. They'll come up with policy. And then you want to figure out how to drive those numbers up, right? The image is of throwing well-being at people as much as you can. And in that sense, you can kind of draw a link between this way of doing policy with a kind of criticism of consequentialist flavored frameworks in general, which is that they treat people too much as receptacles for well-being rather than as agents who get to make decisions for themselves. And you want to facilitate a kind of environment where people can make decisions for themselves and for their kind of various communities they're part of. And life satisfaction is a useful bit of evidence to feed into that, but it's going to involve much more, right? So it's kind of reductive in that sense. So I guess first of all is to check that is roughly right.
That's a great story. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. And then now I feel really kind of, I feel like sticking up for the technocrats because not enough people stick up for them, I feel. So, what could you say? Maybe the claim is like a marginal one, right? Like the way things are done right now at the margin, probably we could do with paying much more attention to these kind of numerical indicators as like a first step. And, maybe one reason you could raise for that is just that existing policies are just so suboptimal. They're doing so poorly with respect to how well we could do in terms of people's well-being, that it's almost worth just deferring those worries until we've sorted those things out, right? So I remember Richard Layard came and gave a talk, and he gave some examples of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Turns out it's fairly inexpensive. It works really well. Why aren't we investing more in this or in community centers or something relative to like HS2? And okay, that's a decision which might get made without consulting the communities who would benefit from it, but maybe that's okay. And then we can worry about involving more stakeholders in the future. Does that make sense? And does that sound kind of plausible?
Thank you. It makes sense, and it's an admirable vision. It's just the vision, once realized, has job centers insisting on people doing cognitive behavioral therapy instead of giving them benefits. The overall vision of a well-being policy is one thing. Its implementation in an environment of austerity and the demise of a welfare state and a great inequality between regions of this country means that it gets plugged into existing practices in much more depressing ways than the ideal shows up, right? Such that you end up saying that, well, tough luck, your housing is so rubbish, and tough luck that your children aren't getting a good education at school. Do some cognitive behavioral therapy to feel better. I mean, that's the overall problem, right? We're gonna, and this is I say that with full respect and admiration of my economist colleagues who tried to come up with these indicators. Besides, I'm very much in favor of numerical indicators of lots of things. I mean, I think they hold politicians into account, and they are they're defensible both on epistemic grounds and on political grounds. I just think that there is this temptation to plug in the life satisfaction as the only indicator, and also to plug it in at the sides, wherever we can, instead of recognizing the need for deeper reform.
I find that really interesting, actually. I think that kind of distinction between what goal you're kind of aiming for and the actual implementation mechanism. That wasn't really something I had in my mind really before, and I think it's worth really contemplating about. And I mean, I think you can kind of make points that might not really be about the well-being topic itself, about what kind of those implementation things look like, where if you want to have something democratic and you want to get all stakeholders involved, that might involve lots of stakeholders that wouldn't even count in a kind of normal democracy. I mean, we've mentioned on previous podcasts the role of future generations, but also people in other countries who don't get involved in the current decision-making process, but even in, like, let's say more local kind of democratic decisions either. And I think that's something really interesting. Something else I kind of wanted to ask about as well, which I think Finn got a little bit at with the cognitive behavioral therapy, is something I saw in like the foreign aid literature, which is this idea of like mental health interventions in developing countries, which caused some kind of small controversy in of itself, but I feel kind of fits into this topic, where it's kind of talking about, okay, well, if our goal is to help people's well-being as opposed to, growing an economy or or something else, then one very effective way to do that might be to try and tackle well-being directly, and to just give mental support to people who are in incredibly challenging and difficult circumstances, and to try and help and alleviate some of the mental suffering that causes. But that also raises interesting questions as well, if that is kind of almost a deflection of some sort, right? Where you're kind of addressing the symptoms of a system that induces suffering. And you're just treating the symptoms as opposed to the actual causes and the inequality and the things that really cause people to have those symptoms in the first place. Do you have any thoughts about that and how to kind of square, I guess, kind of treating maybe the more surface level stuff with like the deeper underlying problems?
Thank you. That is a lovely way of putting it. Let's not be too extreme on either end. So, on the one end, the extreme is, I don't care how the world is. I'll just put on little patches on here and there to relieve suffering as I can. So that's the vision of kind of the effective altruist framework, and I think more generally, also of well-being policies, and wherever it is I can use public money to relieve suffering a little bit is fine by me. That's one extreme. The other extreme is no, this is all sort of just patches. What we need is deep structural change, a revolution, and you are relieving people's anger and misery, when we should be trying to marshal that misery for deep reform and all that. I see these two extremes playing out in debates. I'd love to hear where you think is the good middle. My worry is that, on the revolutionary extreme, we need structural change, we don't need well-being policy. Forgets the fact that, look, we've got one life to live.
Yeah.
And it'd be nice to live it. It'd be nice to enjoy it a little bit, right? And it'd be nice sometimes you do need a patch, right? Sometimes all you need is a patch, right? In the misery of a lockdown, stuck at home with children in winter, not being able to do anything. All I needed were patches just to get through that, right? There was no question about deep structural change to relieve, inequality of labor in my household or something like that.
Yeah.
Crazy, right? On the other hand, you don't want to go to the other. So I think it's a really, really tough place to walk. Two big rocks that you need to sail between. I'd love to hear whether you think there is a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally don't really think I have like a solution to this problem. I mean, it clearly is like very big. I mean, there are definitely different ways I think about like what I can do personally and like what I think should happen, right? And maybe there's a difference between how I try to guide like my own personal actions as opposed to how I think bigger actors like government should influence decisions. And then hence, when I look at how I can influence government in turn, that might change how I think it should behave, if that kind of makes any sense. I realize that's kind of a bit mumbly jumbly, but for example, I don't think that like mental health services in developing countries is like a bad thing to try out, but I would be concerned if that ends up being what the UK government spends its entire aid budget on, right? For example, like I think it's things like that. I, as an individual, I think see value in doing that, and I see the value in those organizations existing, but I'd be worried if they get to a point where they really dominate the conversation and then all the like more structural things get lost. But yeah,
I mean, one of kind of evasive non-answer to give is that very often there isn't attention. So like the CBT example in a developing country, okay, it's good on straightforward measures of subjective well-being. It means people are having a really rough time, have less of a rough time, but also it means that there are hopefully lasting changes where you can just become a more productive member of your community. But let's ask a question, which is whether well-being, just in theory, is the kind of thing that can be represented by one measure or number or construct. And I know that you have argued that maybe we should be thinking more about using so-called mid-level or contextual theories of well-being. Can you just say something about what that means?
So let's just think again, my city council deciding to improve people's well-being of people in Cambridge. What should they be doing? I think what they should be doing is very different from what my therapist should be doing, or my close friend should be doing, or a development economist who is in charge of overall region should be doing. Here's the simple thing, simple thought. The benefactor with concern for me as a person, say my rabbi or my a really close friend, she knows my priorities and the distinct challenges that I face. She knows that I have this problem of not being able to say no, or I have a problem of not knowing how to apportion my responsibilities and starting projects and not finishing them. So genuinely, she knows my predicament very well, right? And talking about well-being with her, it should be a very different exercise from talking about well-being to my city council. Right? My city council should be in charge not of my well-being as a person, as an individual. Rather, they should be in charge of citizen well-being, right? And citizen well-being is not just an addition, right, of all the individual well-beings. Rather, citizen well-being is a different notion. It is a summary of our priorities as citizens of Cambridge to whatever, preserve, walkability of our city, etc., etc. So it's just two completely different notions. So when I talk about us needing mid-level theories of well-being, I talk about precisely that. The need to identify the context in which you are working, and then build a theory of well-being for each of that context. And measures of subjective well-being may well have a place in a given mid-level theory, but we first have to start with recognition that we're talking about well-being qua what? Qua individual, not qua citizen, qua new mom, qua etc., etc. So these are the issues that I think line up naturally with the rejection of technocratic approach to well-being. Right? If you think that mid-level theories of well-being is what we need to do, then you're going to want to set up a political process to do them responsibly. So the idea of mid-level theory is the idea that when we're asking about well-being, we should be very clear about the context in which we're asking it and what we're going to do about it. And once we have specified the context, we should set up a very responsible and inclusive process for filling out this notion of well-being.
Yeah, so I was going to ask kind of a question about how this might look in practice, because I think I'm very aware that, decisions that, everywhere from council to national government, the decisions that these institutions need to make are often really, really hard. And there is like a genuine trade-off where some people will kind of be left off, very frustrated and very angry. And that might hurt some people's, well-being very objectively, for the greater good of some other people's well-being. And there is like some, I guess, kind of concern I might have where that kind of deliberation or that kind of more democracy-minded idea just might not be able to make those hard decisions that in the same way that a technocratic process can make. So maybe to give like a clearer example, one thing that kind of popped in my mind here was like the not in my backyard kind of movement. I don't know if this kind of rings a bell, but there is like a clear kind of signal, at least you would say, from the market and from prices, that as house prices go up, there's clearly a consumer preference demand for more housing. But then people actually often bring in what is essentially kind of a well-being argument that you can't build houses here because this hurts me in all of these indirect ways, and kind of hits the social capital of my local community, or, think of many of these indirect effects it can have. And that can be a real obstacle, right? So what I think outsiders would say seems like a pretty clear solution of kind of building more affordable low-income housing. And there is this kind of concern that I'd be interested to kind of hear your perspective on, of where this kind of trade-off happens in this like more deliberative process, or how well-being can kind of square off with those with more power and those with less power, is precisely in those kinds of institutions that end up making those decisions.
That's a great way of emphasizing the difficulty. This is the point at which, if you are interested in well-being policy or effective altruism or anything like that, you kind of inevitably get sucked into a vision of politics, even if you didn't mean to. So I take on board both the impracticality and the difficulty and the selfishness and the frustrating nature of local democratic exercises. That is absolutely true. But when you say it is easier to solve this problem technocratically, what you mean by easier is just that the technocratic approach will tell us what to do, and we can go ahead and do it. But it's not easier in long term, right? In the long term, we are seeing the effect of distrust of experts, right? We're seeing the loss of the loss of trust in science, and the loss of the increasing alienation of public from different forms of expertise, whether it's scientists or social workers or policymakers or think tank workers. We don't want that, right? And the reason why this alienation is not just a frustrating fact to be patched, but is to be expected, is because public policy is filled, and social science is filled with thick concepts, right? Concepts that are partly judging, partly describing, like progress, well-being, resilience, frailty, things like that. And that because they are partly value laden, unless you think you are an expert on values, right, you're going to need to recognize that you're going to have to be inclusive, right, in setting those problems. So the price that you pay for the for the ease of the technocratic approach is that down the line you lose the you lose the trust and the take-up of your community, and then you have these much more uncomfortable and much harsher politics that we're facing at the moment, like politics that seem to lead to dramatic polarization. We are forever facing a tension between local involvement on the one hand and wanting to do the right thing on the other hand, all things considered. And it is there is no single resolution of it, is my view, right? And I do very much hope that plenty of good, genuine, thorough expertise that is informed by local concerns can nevertheless make a dent, because it would be, I do believe ultimately that there is such a thing as expertise about the social, and therefore there is expertise about values, because the social is value laden. So I do passionately believe in social science and in its power and in its responsibility. It probably just needs to be more spread out and more connected.
Okay, let's talk a bit about something else you've written about, which is the role of formal models in social science. And one way to start talking about this is to bring up a paper you co-wrote about the application of a particular model to explain truces in World War I trench warfare. So maybe could you say something about what that paper was trying to do, and also whether you think it succeeded and why?
One of the most fascinating facts about contemporary economics is the importance of models that are recognizable and very simple and can be transported to different situations. And there is no better example of that than the prisoner's dilemma. It's a set piece. It is some people have called it the E. coli of social science. That means it appears in very many different places, and there is a kind of, I think, even a standard trope. This is a prisoner's dilemma. Pandemic is a prisoner's dilemma, and the price war between supermarkets is a prisoner's dilemma. Yuppies on the dating market is a prisoner's dilemma. So that kind of, sometimes it's not prisoner's dilemma, sometimes it's some other non-cooperative game, sometimes it's some coordination game. There is a big library of that, and I'm not. Some people are worried about you think it's a prisoner's dilemma. No, in fact, it's the stack hunt game. That's not what I'm worried about. I think I'm worried about more generally this vision of social science where we prize the generality over the specificity. So we think that the best way to understand the social world is to make a library of abstract models that then can be applied in different places, and we shall thereby find the unifying logic of social life, and we will be able to provide solid social explanations for that. Perhaps in similar way as I'm skeptical about a single theory of well-being, I'm skeptical about the ability of models to do as much as the investment of them betrays the trust to do. So, given that to become an economist at this point is, it's de rigueur, you have to also be a modeler. And it's the definition of economics is to learn to be a modeler. Rather than, for instance, learn to be a surveyor or learn to be an ethnographer or learn to be a whole load of empirical skills that, say, a biologist needs to get. I think economics for a long time has overinvested in a certain particular mode of knowledge. There is nothing inherently wrong and completely hopeless about this form of knowledge. No, the model-based science is completely normal and recognizable through history of science. And I just think that the best way to understand social world is to do as much as possible in using as many different methods as possible. And this was the motivation behind writing this paper. When we try to pin people down and say, well, okay, you're saying this situation is a prisoner's dilemma. Can we dig deeper? can you show me that the structure of the game is actually replicated in the situation as you're saying it? You try to scratch the surface, and very quickly this falls off, right? It turns out that the situation is much more complex. It turns out that that the prisoner's dilemma doesn't actually make correct prediction. And I think the truce in trenches of World War One is a good example of the failure of the prisoner's dilemma, with infinite horizon, with tit for tat strategy. I mean, it's just it was represented still and in the textbooks as the big empirical success of prisoner's dilemma, and it very much is not. But the message is wider. I think a healthy social science and a healthy economics in particular is an economics that spreads its methodological bets. And I think it's very much happening in economics. I think economics is changing very fast as we speak in terms of the priorities and the methods that are being taught. And all things considered, I'm quite optimistic about the changes.
Yeah, so I guess just to try and understand here what you were saying. So I'm just curious, is this mostly a critique then against misapplication of certain terms or certain theories when they get just, people just say this is the prisoner's dilemmas, but they don't actually do the actual studies or a rigorous enough investigation to check this? Or is it that they shouldn't even be using game theoretic frameworks to begin with to analyze the situation, or at least not just game theoretic things? Where do you kind of fall on that then?
This is a very helpful distinction, Luca. Thank you. So the distinction is between should you be investing in better application of models, or should you be investing in less model building? So I would like to say both. So if you're going to say that what's so amazing about famous economic models like Market for Lemons or Prisoner's Dilemma or any one of these is their amazing explanatory power, then you better roll up your sleeves and show that it does have that amazing explanatory power, and you do that empirically. So this is a point against what's been known as the casual empiricism that you encounter among economic theorists sometimes. That, well, yeah, I've got a super clever model. It looks lovely, like Market for Lemons, for instance. It can explain why you get swindled by the used car dealer. No, you need to do more if you want to grant the explanation. But the second point is also true, that if your goal and if your big priority for your science is solid, empirically grounded causal explanations of a significant phenomena, then the best thing to do is not overinvest in one mode of investigating those phenomena. So I'm here speaking against this traditional vision that economics is defined by certain methods, such that if you don't do optimization modeling, for instance, you are not doing economics, you're doing something else. So I think that's a mistake. I think economics should be defined by a range of significant phenomena that we want to understand, and then economics should invest in a range of different methodologies that allow us to tackle those phenomena. So it's both of those things you said.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is just kind of like a small tangent point, but it reminds me a bit of like a general debate in kind of heterodox economics as well. And I think we explored it in one of our episodes, but there's almost like two ways to kind of diversify the debate, right? And one is like for economics to just become a lot more narrow, actually, and to just really focus on models, and then to just open up, I guess, space for other ways. And then the other way would be to actually make economics itself more diverse. And those are like two different approaches. One in like making economics much more theory-based, much more maths-based, and then just making sure that we have more anthropologists or sociologists and other kind of social sciences as well in discussion. And then I guess like a harder one would be getting those people actually involved in the economics debate itself. And I think there is more than just like a semantic difference between these two.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
It's an interesting idea.
I agree, and I'm very much on the second side. Here is why. Economics, as it matters. The political economy of contemporary social sciences matters for this decision. And the political economy is such that economists have many more access and much more clout than other social scientists. And it's an interesting historical question how they have acquired that clout. But bottom line is that they get to have the ears of policymakers a lot more than other social scientists, and which is why it is really important to make economics as good as it possibly can. And I'm actually optimistic about that. I mean, I think the so-called empirical turn is not just economists doing more empirical stuff. No, it's that the prestige is more evenly distributed, right? That the prestige no longer goes to just the modeler. So in my previous work, that was my PhD dissertation, I studied the role of game theorists in the spectrum auctions, and I saw that when I learned how the spectrum auctions were constructed in different countries and the role of game theorists, my first thought was that, my God, it was an incredibly joint exercise. The experimentalists were absolutely crucial to it, and the software engineers were absolutely crucial, and yet the glory went to the game theorist. Right. And, when the FT and the Wall Street Journal covered it, it's all about how game theory used to be just maths, but now finally, right. How is it that modelers get to appropriate credit like this? That is completely unhealthy. And I think that is what's changing in economics, and that what fills me with optimism.
Maybe kind of one last question here that I was keen to ask is that, we've been talking this whole time not so much about kind of deep questions about philosophy of science, but really about how different kinds of social science are just implemented, are like done in the practice. And maybe there's a kind of, standard picture of how philosophy of science is taught, or what it is, which is, okay, it's more or less answering questions like, what is the scientific method? And then you tell a story, you start with someone like Popper, you go through Kuhn, maybe kind of Lakatos if you're getting fancy at the end. And that's it, like case closed. And it sounds like if that's all there is to it, then it's missing something. At least that's something I would expect you to say. So can you kind of maybe speak for the value of talking about scientific norms and institutions and practice, as well as the kind of deeper questions? Do those questions belong to philosophy of science, or is that more or less someone else's business?
Oh, what a great question, Finn. I appreciate you asking it because you've probably been through that paper, right? The paper 6, and you've seen how we still teach it with kind of Vienna Circle, Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, and then some stuff at the end. I am so deeply conflicted about it because on the one hand, I am I, of course, take on board this point that science is a social institution, and getting it right means fixing a social institution or reforming a social institution. And that means talking about its practices, how, review is organized, how grants making is organized, how peer reports are organized. You have to talk about the norms and institutions. On the other hand, the heart of our discipline is in those big logical questions. Do you do induction or do you do falsification? or do you do a little bit of both? Do you work within a paradigm, or do you try to do a revolutionary science? These are the questions that have defined philosophy of science. These are the questions that have excited our audiences for many, many decades. And the big challenge to someone like me, who believes that there is more to science than its logic, is to try and put my money where my mouth is. Well, okay, redesign the course. Make philosophy of science more true to life, and that's a genuine challenge. I try to do that in my teaching, but nowhere near. I mean, I'm still intellectually a grandchild of these great men, right? And I'm intellectually a daughter of a great woman, Nancy Cartwright, who is my greatest influence in philosophy of science. And yes, I think there is more to science than scientific method, and yet at the same time, you are given 8 hours to get of lecture time in the year to get to the young scientists and to emphasize to them the importance of doing history and philosophy of science, and you have to make those painful choices, and you have to get them to. I'm conflicted about it, is what I'm saying, and I don't have a good answer.
No, fantastic. And this doesn't need to be a question if it doesn't have to be, but one thing you're going to end up doing as a philosopher of science is thinking and writing about science. But another thing you can do is talking to scientists and making recommendations about scientific practice. And I appreciate that the fact that you're doing that seems, maybe that is a question. Yeah, should people be doing that more?
Well, so again, let's try and not have that model of the technocrat and the policymaker, right? So let's not imagine that there's going to be the philosopher king or the philosopher queen that will come to scientists and tell them how to do their things better. Because if there is anything we know, and then certain methods work or don't work precisely because they are embedded in certain institutions, right? So to come to economists and tell economists, can you do less modeling? Because my ideal vision of a discipline is one that spreads its methodological bet, is just extremely unrealistic. The economist is going to tell me, well, hold on. We've got this model of how we evaluate each other's contribution. We need to publish a paper in the top 5 journal, and we need to publish 3 of them to get tenure. In those journals, what referees value is a really thorough and strong investment into producing such a model. And how long it takes to teach a young economist to do that. So what you're telling me, the best thing to do is completely unrealistic, given that, I've got a department to run, I've got a life to live, I've got a degree to organize, right? So those questions will be really thorny.
The crucial mistake there was saying speaking at rather than talking with, right? Which is maybe the better model. Okay, let's wrap up then. Luke, I don't know if you want to ask these questions. I've been going on a bit, but the two final questions.
Yeah, sure. So I guess happy to ask the first one, which is a question we ask all our guests, and that is, what is a recent thing you have changed your mind about and why?
Good one. Everything I changed my mind on has the same structure. There is an extreme position, and I just move a little bit away from that extreme position. And so examples like this abound. Economic models don't explain used to be my view. So good social science is one that's grounded in good philosophy of well-being. Again, I've moved away from that extreme because now I think it's probably going to be has to be grounded in good politics as well as philosophy. and so on and so forth, that there is no way for a numerical indicator to represent a complex value like well-being. I also think that is too extreme. I think depending on the situation in which we are, a numerical indicator can be perfectly good enough. So I think most of my developments are usually kind of formulating first a very uncompromising position that I am excited about, and then gently moving away from that, which is a very kind of middle-aged thing to do, isn't it? But I hope I won't just I won't just end up straight in the middle, but because I'm constantly looking for new extremes to formulate, right? I'm trying not to inherit extremes from other people.
I think I'm definitely in like a young person's dilemma where I'm just fluctuating between like completely polar extreme positions just on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, just enjoy it. It must be fun more than anything.
Absolutely. Okay, very last question then is what 3 books or articles, films, whatever else would you recommend for anyone interested in finding out more about everything we've talked about?
I, in general, have 3 big influences intellectually in my thinking. I've already mentioned one, Nancy Cartwright. She was my dissertation advisor and a very important mentor for me, and someone who really taught me to appreciate and taught me not to be embarrassed of being interested in social sciences, and taught me to appreciate the importance of the tangle of practice, as she puts it. So anything by her, but I think my favorite book is Hunting Causes and Using Them. After that, my really big influence was someone I worked with in St. Louis, Missouri, while I lived there, and that's Professor Dan Habron of St. Louis University. So Dan is the most exciting and true-to-life scholar of happiness that I know of. So his book, Pursuit of Unhappiness, was a big starting point for me, and I still think that his emotional state theory of happiness is the best one there is. And then as I got interested more in the interplay between social science and politics, I came to appreciate the writings of Elizabeth Anderson, the philosopher and women's studies professor in Michigan, who is constantly managing to find responsible and attractive ways of marrying facts and values, is how I'm going to put it. So I will send you my favorite article by her on divorce.
What a fantastic list, and I look forward to reading that article. Anna Alexandrova, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was Anna Alexandrova on well-being, alternatives to technocracy, and why models are overrated. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Anna, that's with 2 N's. There you'll find links to all the books and articles Anna mentioned, along with more details and examples. As always, it would be great if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there's a link on the website to an anonymous feedback form. There's also a new star rating form on each write-up. And you can send suggestions, questions, hate mail, whatever else to feedback@hearthisidea.com. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, if you would like to support the show more directly and help us to continue to pay for hosting, you can also leave a tip by following the link in the show notes. Thanks very much for listening.